If someone in your family died in ancient Egypt, you had about an hour to make a decision that would shape the rest of your life, and theirs, for eternity. In a low building on the edge of the desert, someone was tearing linen into long strips. The air smelled of salt and resin. Whoever lay on the table inside had a family somewhere, going about their mourning, not yet knowing how the day would end. That family lived in a town on the west bank of the Nile, in the shadow of the Valley of the Kings. The man's name was Car. He was a plasterer, 41 years old, and 2 days earlier he had been perfectly well. A fever took him in a single night. By morning his wife, Meret, was a widow at 38, with a daughter of 11 and a household that ran, from that moment, on a different set of rules. The first rule was speed. In the heat of Upper Egypt, a body could not wait for grief to pass. Decay set in within hours, and everyone in the household understood this without being told. By the time the neighbors had gathered to offer their condolences, men from the embalmers had already arrived to collect the body. Before they left, Meret had to make her decision. She had perhaps an hour. The man waiting to hear her answer was a WT priest, an embalmer, a professional, and not someone given to softening bad news. There were 3 levels of treatment, he told her, and he had given this explanation more times than he could count. The finest treatment removed the brain through the nostril, took out the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, and placed each one in its own sealed jar. The body was then packed in natron salt for 40 days, until it was completely dry. After that came fine linen, layer upon layer, with protective amulets worked in between the wrappings, and finally a painted mask over the face. This was the treatment of scribes, overseers, people of standing. It was also, Meret knew before the priest had finished speaking, well beyond what a weaver's household could afford. The middle treatment worked differently. Cedar oil was injected into the body to dissolve the internal organs from within, and the body was dried in nature in the same way 40 days. No shortcuts there. There were no jars, no mask, no separate chamber for the organs. The body came back wrapped, preserved, and whole in form, which, for most families, was the part that mattered most. The third option was simpler still, the body purged, dried, and returned with the bare minimum of wrapping. It was what families chose when there was, genuinely, nothing left to choose from. Meret chose the middle treatment. She did not need long to decide. She had already done this arithmetic more than once, in the quiet hours after Carr first fell ill. Within the hour, Carr's body was gone, carried west toward the embalmer's workshop. Meret went back to her loom, because the next 70 days had to be lived through somehow. 70 days. That was how long the process took, start to finish, and it began the moment Carl's body reached the Waybert, the embalmer's workshop on the desert edge. For the first 40 days, the body lay packed in natron, the salt drawing the moisture out of it, slowly. There was nothing dramatic about this stage. It was time, and salt, doing their work, and nothing more. Meanwhile, Meret wove. Linen was the family trade, and it did not stop being the family trade because someone had died. If anything, there was more reason to keep working now, not less. Her daughter, 11 years old, sat nearby and watched her mother do this work through the days as though nothing had changed, while everything had. What was happening to Carr in those same 40 days was not something Meret could see. But it was no mystery to her, either. Everyone in Der al-Medina knew roughly what went on inside the Waybert. Once the drying was complete, the wrapping began. Layer after layer of linen, wound tightly around each limb individually before the whole body was bound together, work that took specialist hands and several more weeks. Between the layers, at specific points on the body, the embalmers placed amulets, small protective objects, each one doing a particular job. One thing was never removed in any of the 3 treatments. The heart stayed exactly where it was. Egyptians believed it would be weighed, later, against a feather, and a body without a heart could not be weighed at all. On the 20th day or so, Carr's older brother arrived at Meret's door. His name was Yuzahat, and he had heard from someone which treatment Meret had chosen. He did not think it was enough. Yuzahat offered to cover the difference, enough silver to upgrade Carr to the full treatment, jars and mask and all, even this far into the process. There was a condition, though. In exchange, Meret and her daughter would move into Yuzahat's household, give up the workshop, the loom the home car had built for them. It was not, by user hat's lights, an unreasonable offer. A widow and a young niece, taken in by a family, that was how things were done. He may even have believed, sincerely, that car deserved better than Meret could give him. But Meret would have been trading her independence for her husband's jars. She said no. What she could provide instead was modest, but not nothing. A small papyrus scroll, copied with the selection of spells from the Book of the Dead, the ones a family of her means could afford to commission. 4 amulets, each chosen for what it protected: the eye, the throat, the spine, the heart. And a small set of Ashapti figures, perhaps half a dozen of them. Ashapti were workers. In the afterlife, the dead were expected to labor in the fields, the way the living did along the Nile, and an Ashapti, when called upon, would step forward and do the work instead. It was, in effect, the ancient equivalent of arranging cover for a shift one would rather not work oneself. The days went on. 40 became 50, 50 became 60. And then, on the 70th day, word came from the way that the car was ready. Meret walked out to the embalmer's workshop with her daughter to collect him. What came out was not the man who had left 70 days before. It was a wrapped, sealed shape, light in a way a body should not be. The wrapped body was carried to the entrance of the tomb, a modest shaft cut into the cliffs above the village, the kind of resting place a plasterer's family could secure. There, before the body went in, came the most important ritual of the entire 70 days, the opening of the mouth. A priest stepped forward holding in adze a small, curved blade, the kind a craftsman-like Carl would have recognized from his own tools. He touched it, lightly, to the mouth of the wrapped figure. Then the eyes. Then the ears. The idea was simple and old and taken completely seriously. Carls carved the part of him that would go on needing food, conversation, the world, could not see, hear, eat or speak unless those senses were restored to the body that housed it. The ceremony gave him that back. Without it, everything else, the racking, the amulets, the spells, had nowhere to take effect. Meret's daughter stood close to her mother and watched the whole thing. She was 11. She would remember this. After the ceremony came the procession proper, and even a modest funeral in Egypt was a procession. Professional mourners walked ahead of the coffin, their grief performed loudly and on purpose. That was, in part, the point of them being there. The wrapped body travelled on a wooden sledge, dragged across the sand. Wheels were of little use here, and a sledge needed no road. Behind it came the goods Meret had managed to gather. Furniture, jars of food and beer, the small papyrus scroll, the 4 amulets, the Ashapti wrapped carefully in cloth. None of it was grand. All of it represented weeks of weaving, traded carefully, piece by piece, for exactly these things. The tomb itself was a shaft dropping straight down into the rock, with a single small chamber at the bottom. No painted walls, no long corridor, only enough room for Car and what he had been given. The goods went down first, then the coffin. A priest spoke the formula that was always spoken, words asking that Car receive bread, beer, and offerings for as long as his name was remembered. Then the entrance was sealed. A slab of stone, set into the rock and plastered over perhaps by men who did exactly this kind of work for a living, the same trade Car himself had practiced. And that was the end of it. Not the end of Car, in Meret's understanding, but the end of what the living could do for him. She walked home with her daughter's hand in hers, back across the sand toward the village, the cliffs and the sealed door already settling into the landscape behind them, one mark among many, on a hillside full of marks. Whether it had been enough, the middle treatment, the small scroll, the modest amulets, the half-dozen Ashapti, was not a question Meret could answer. She believed the scales would balance. She believed the spells would work. And belief, in this case, was not a small thing. It was the only currency left that mattered, once the silver had already changed hands. The next morning, Meret was back at her loom before the heat of the day set in. The shuttle passed through the warp, the way it had the day before, and the day before that. The work continued, because the work always did.